Hey, let's go over Soviet tanks. Except these aren't Soviet tanks. These are Lend-Lease tanks. These are tanks from the Anglo Americans. I like to use that more and more. The term. That's actually one of these 76 equipped Shermans. And you see some of the other vehicles. The Lend-Lease. What was Lend-Lease? Right. Right, the Lend-Lease was how Roosevelt got around isolationist popular sentiment in the United States. They didn't want to get involved in the war. So the way to go around the will of the people. Anyway, I'm not even gonna this point. It's funny too is that Lend-Lease was given to the British and the Soviets by America. The British paid it back, I think, in the 2000s. And the Soviets, they stopped paying after a while. So it was a good way to put Britain in hock, so to speak. But, obviously the British also gave a form of Lend-Lease to the Soviets. Right? So you see, the M3s, right? And you see all these American and British tanks on the other side of the world. The Matilda, I always like the Matilda. It's like the smallest heavy tank there was. It's not that big. There's another Matilda. So it's just, looking through here, of course, the British start. And of course, right away, the Soviets, they don't have, remember, the best tank in the war, in quotation marks, the T-34, the KB-1s, they don't have a lot of them. They're not training the guys well, so most of the Soviet tanks are not really any better. Probably even a little worse than what the British had at the time. Okay, you see cool pictures like this. A Valentine. Actually, the Valentine was the one tank they did like, but Matilda had problems in the snow. The way these tracks were, the snow would give it problems. Right? And none of the British stuff, and originally the American stuff, was armed well enough by Soviet standards. But most Soviet tanks, like I said, weren't that great either, and they lost the majority of those. But of course, as the Soviets are being given this stuff, right? There's the later Valentines, the ones made in Canada that were made just for the Soviet Union, right? The Canadian Valentine. But as you can see, the Soviets were not too impressed with the stuff that they were essentially given. Okay? If I was in charge of things, I wouldn't have given them a damn thing. In fact, I probably would have given another country. Anyways, thought we're looking at this. So yeah, the Valentine tank was the one tank they sort of liked because it had a decent amount of armor, although it didn't save this one here. You're gonna see a lot of these things knocked out. Okay? But they kind of like this tank. You see this tank show up later. I'll show you in another book. We even had this thing, this Tetrarch, this light tank. I always love these guys riding on the tanks with the submachine guns. It was sort of like a way to carry the infantry into close combat, and for these infantry guys to protect the tanks. Most of the time, a lot of these dudes got fucking blown to bits. Look, now you got American stuff. Now you got, of course, the M3. Oh, you don't like the M3 either. They don't like it. But they don't mind taking them, right? So there's a lot of nice, interesting photos. So this one they call it the grave for seven brothers, right? Because it had rivets still. It was very high, so it's okay. I wouldn't give them nothing, but it's interesting. It's not like they didn't turn the tanks away, but always a weird tank, that M3. Always a weird tank. Obviously, the whole issue in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Front was the tank battles. Everything was tank battles, and the firepowers and the armor just kept increasing on either side. Them knocked out Matilda. Whatever, great photos. Here's one that was a Valentine that was abandoned. I hope the Germans took this. So it's always cool when you have the Germans take all the enemy tanks into their service. They paint the cross on it, and they always give it a name, like a number, and they always have the country that it's taken from will be the letter designation. I thought that was pretty interesting. They even gave him the helmets, those stupid football helmets and the Tommy guns. Interesting. So now you see, like, this is obviously computer art. I don't like the computer art. I understand why they do it. Of course, the Soviets, they didn't like this either. They didn't, oh, no, they don't like it. No like it yet. They don't like the church. The crews probably like this. It's probably the most protection these poor bastards ever got. So you started getting some of the heavy assault guns later. So, and of course, the M4. Now, I guess the M4 was the silhouette was way too high. But the crews that were assigned these things mostly liked them, especially when they got the 76 armed ones. But they liked them because they're reliable. The greatest tank ever made, the T-34 in quotation marks. The quality wasn't that good, even when they were moving their factories further inland. So a lot of them were not durable. They didn't last. They wouldn't last long. The American tanks would last a long time. So, it is. Oh man, just blew the turret off that. So, look, they knocked the Churchill out. So, like I said, these tanks were made for support, like the infantry support. But it's interesting seeing, like, these tanks on the other side of the world. There's one of the Valentines with the bigger gun, but it didn't save it. Yeah. Anyway, just going through. Yeah, with this. The Russians always beat the Prussians. Oh. Yeah, there's one of the 76 ones. The M4, the 76 millimeter one. So they had a lot of these. I think the Soviets had about 6,000 of these things. So anyway, now there's always the argument. Of course, the Soviets, the Lend Lease was like, oh, it's nothing. You did not help us. Right? The tanks mostly, right. The Soviets started making better tanks. They didn't really want the American tanks, but they wanted the American trucks. You could argue that maybe the trucks were even a bigger deal. Okay, but remember, even the tanks, well, these guys were desperate in 41. They were taking whatever they could get, while still insulting it. Final assessment, you get the numbers here. So obviously, Britain was bankrupted. The Soviet Union didn't matter. In America was on top. How wonderful. And the trucks, I mean, in the end, the trucks were more important. The Germans were still transporting stuff with horses. Across a very thin line. When you actually read how many German armored vehicles were operational at any one moment, it's a wonder these Soviets didn't roll over them sooner. But anyway, it was interesting. Interesting to look at the tanks. I think they still have some. They're still finding these tanks too, man. It's hard. Like some farmer will hit something and they'll find some tank destroyed long ago. So now, we might as well just round it out here. Soviet tanks in Manchuria. So this is at the end now. The Soviets are finally, the Germans are defeated. So now they're gonna turn eastward and finally deal with those pesky Japanese in Manchuria. And it was interesting because at this point, it was such a one-sided thing. Obviously, the Red Army had learned a lot from fighting the Germans. They conducted, heavy combined arms, deep combat, all these terms that the Stavka had talked about. The German that had been theorized, but were found wanting and eventually developed after dealing with the enemy that was doing it to them. So you still had, it's interesting, of course, the first clash between the Soviets and the Japanese. The Soviets, with losses, pretty much resoundingly defeated the Japanese. And the Japanese, this is where they decided they didn't want to deal with the Soviets. They were going to go south and attack the Americans and the British and everyone else, which is anyway. But you still had like these older tanks, the BT-7, even the T-26, the things you had in the Spanish Civil War. But at this point now, you have T-34s, you have these dudes running around with the machine guns. And of course, they have plenty of these American tanks, right? The M4s, obviously, the T-34-85s. What was interesting was the T-34-85, especially going through the Mongolia, right? Going through the deserts. The wider tracks of these things were much better. The more narrow tracks on these, they actually had to tow these things. So the American tank was found wanting in this Mongolian sort of, East Asian kind of steppes region. That's interesting. Uh, Now, just obviously, the Valentines. They still love these Valentine tanks, but now you're starting to get some crazy. You're starting to get these crazy assault guns, man. I mean, the Germans were still the best, but the Soviet assault guns, you gotta have. I got a soft spot in my heart for them. They're so ugly and they're so big, and they're literally just, take a big gun and put in metal hull, on a chassis, and just send them out. Right? So now, of course, we got maps here, right? They attacked from Mongolia, and they attacked also from, where the USSR borders Manchuria. Right? Remember Port Arthur? Remember that? And these monsters, right? The Su-85, the Su-100. Look at this thing. Oh, of course, they still didn't have a machine gun, so you had, but you had those guys riding on the back. Look at these monsters, right? And you talk about a monster. They still had these KB1s, but the ISU-152. This is on the chassis of the Joseph Stalin tank. I had gone over this in the Tiger vs. All books. Right? And while Tigers would still knock these things out, look at this monster. Look at this thing. Holy jeez. Right. I always liked these amphibious Soviet tanks. So obviously very light. Actually, Kurt Meyer in his book talked about how the 20 millimeter armored cars were shooting these up as they were trying to cross the river to get to them and like wipe them all out. But I still like this tank. It's just cool. But we're in another era now with this. So look at these things, man. These ISU-52s. Of course, the Valentine. They like these Valentines too. They like the M4s and they like the Valentines. So, and obviously, they would just take the chassis of a T-34 and use it as a, to tow vehicles. But anyway, getting to the actual battle, man, it really wasn't much of a battle. So, the Red Army did what the Red Army does good, raping the Japanese, women. The problem is when they started raping the Chinese women, that we were having problems. So I don't think Putin talked about that last night when he was talking to Tuck. Oh, don't bring that up. So actually, I thought Putin was pretty cool, to be frank. But look at these friggin' things. Holy jeez. Meanwhile, the Japanese tanks, they still have those 95 Hagos. The Japanese totally are not ready for what is coming. And the battle analysis, you had this, right? The human bombs. The most damage that they were able to do at all in any of these tanks were these poor bastards running under the tank with the charges. Of course, having these guys is very useful when you're dealing with that. But right, so obviously the Japanese did horribly, and lots of Japanese surrendered. Okay, a lot of them surrendered, and even when it wasn't like they were all starving and had been fighting for a while. They surrendered en masse. They knew that they were defeated. Unlike the Pacific, it still makes you wonder about what I went over with Lindbergh talking about the Marines not taking prisoners. But right, and like I said, even with the lopsided weaponry, right, the attacks succeeded against the Soviet T-34, like Smertniks, condemned men. Well, I guess the Soviet Union, they would have a good word for condemned men, right? They inflicted 30,000 casualties on the Soviets, but was it enough? Anyway, it just was interesting to see, at this point, man, especially these monsters, man. And like I said, the Japanese just having no chance at the end of Yep. Manchuria, the Manchus. That interesting part of China, but yep, you give the Soviet tanks. You give them some spotlight here. That would be fair, right?